When Nintendo first launched the 3DS, Capcom tossed its hat into the ring early with Resident Evil Revelations, which delivered some of the finest visuals on the system. Yet, despite its success, the sequel was not made for the 3DS at all. Now, with the Nintendo Switch, Capcom is finally trying to rectify this by releasing both games on Nintendo's latest hardware. The question is, how does it stack up against previous releases? Let's find out. For this video, we'll be looking at both games, but as Revelations 2 is the more interesting game technically, we're going to start with it. Released in 2015 across a huge number of platforms including current and last generation consoles, Revelations 2 is an interesting follow-up to the 3DS original. It's powered by one of the more recent versions of MT Framework and features numerous visual enhancements over the original Revelations. To start with, in terms of resolution, Capcom has made the right choice here. In docked mode, we're looking at a full native 1080p, while handheld is reduced to 720p. It's the best the Switch has to offer and makes for a nice change of pace after some of the recent sub-native releases. Unfortunately, this is also where the first downside becomes clear. Anti-aliasing has been cut from the game entirely. If we compare to the PS4 version, edges on Switch are less refined and more aliased overall, producing a noisier overall image in the process. At this point, you might be noticing a difference in terms of image clarity, and in fact, at first glance, it might even seem like the textures themselves are higher resolution on the Switch. In reality, that's not quite the case. In fact, when looking at smaller details such as the belt and buckle textures in this scene, it's clear that the PS4 version still has an advantage over the Switch. World textures, however, are basically identical, so why do they appear sharper in scenes like this? Well, it appears that a form of sharpening is applied to the image, resulting in, well, sharper looking textures, but also more visible noise and shimmering. Specular highlights appear much noisier than on PS4 as well. In comparison, the other consoles use FXAA, which can blur the image, in addition to a subtle bloom pass of sorts, giving them a softer overall look. As for which one looks better then, it's really a matter of personal preference, and even with this sharpening, Revelations 2 does look good on the Switch, providing a general visual quality that seems nearly on par with the other releases. If you look closely, however, there are definitely visible differences to be found. First up, shadows. In the original release, the flashlight can cast shadows when pointing towards specific pieces of scenery or characters. On Switch, this feature has been eliminated entirely in the pursuit of faster performance. For a horror game, this is a big loss and it does reduce the atmosphere in certain scenes, but it's understandable. Next, the draw distance of foliage has been reduced significantly, with grass visibly popping into view as you run through the environment. When starting the second chapter, grass is completely missing on the Switch and doesn't appear until you move closer. We also ran into weird loading issues from time to time, like this, where the entire background struggled to load into memory as we ran through the environment. This is all while installed to a fast SD card. Unfortunately, due to the size of the game, it really wasn't feasible to test it on the system's internal storage without basically deleting everything else. Something to consider when picking the game up, because Revelations 2 is only available as a digital download. Speaking of loading, this is another issue where the port stumbles. When loading a chapter, Revelations 2 requires a significant amount of waiting time before jumping into the game. It takes a lot longer to load than it does on PS4 or Xbox One, that's for sure. Thankfully, once in the game, it is mostly seamless, but these initial loads for each chapter are frustratingly long. Another issue that stands out is the handling of hair and cloth animation. While running around, Claire's hair visibly bounces along with her coattail, and these appear to be updated at a slower rate than the PS4 version, giving the impression of less fluid animation. A minor thing, but something that stuck out to me since you're looking at these character models the entire game. Still, while certain visual elements have suffered, the overall presentation is very close to the original PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game. It's not perfect, but it's close enough for a less powerful machine. It's also a significant step up from the other mobile version of the game released previously, the PS Vita edition. This port is one of the worst on Vita, and it's immediately clear that Switch offers a massively enhanced experience here. Okay, so we're stuck using docked footage here on the Switch side since the game doesn't allow portable video capture, But aside from resolution, docked and portable are basically the same. The Vita version features significantly reduced texture quality, a big drop in performance, lower quality lighting, and more. It barely resembles the original game at all in some scenes. If you've been looking for a portable version of the game then, the Switch is finally capable of providing just that. Unfortunately, whichever mode you choose, there is one issue with this version that I'd like to see improved, and that's frame rate. You see, Revelations 2 on Switch runs with an uncapped frame rate. It attempts to reach 60 frames per second, but generally falls below this. If we bring in the PS4 version for comparison, it's immediately clear that the Nintendo version falls far behind in terms of frame rate. It's even worse in cutscenes like this, where we see the average performance sit much closer to 30 frames per second rather than 60. Basically, we'd prefer an option for a capped 30 FPS experience. The added judder incurred by using an uncapped frame rate looks rather terrible in comparison and results in a game that feels jerkier than it should. At 30 FPS, we'd at least be looking at a very stable level of performance. Well, at least in most areas. The demanding forest section gives the Switch some issues as well. Now, this is an interesting area since the PS4 version used to struggle with it too, at least at launch, but thankfully, it's received many patches since we last looked at the game, and, well, you see the results. This area now turns in a very stable 60 frames per second, even on a regular base PS4, while the launch day version could drop almost as low as the Switch. So, might we expect the same thing here then? Improvements on the Switch? Well, probably not worth getting your hopes up at this point since the game is in a more mature state now than it was back at launch. It would be nice to see a boost to frame rate, but it's simply not close enough to 60 frames per second to be viable. The best solution here is simply offer a 30 FPS cap as an option for users that prefer stability. In the end, bearing in mind the hardware itself, the Switch port is decent. It loses some visual fidelity and performance over the other current generation console versions, but still manages to come reasonably close. It's not what I would call a smashing success, mind you, but it is ultimately a very decent port. Which brings us to the original Revelations. Previously on Digital Foundry. The Switch version is looking pretty good. These BOWs have never looked sharper. Wait, the frame rate isn't very good here at all. What's going on? And wait, we're missing shadows too? This isn't good at all. Ah well, at least you can play it portable. On to the next game. Resident Evil. As mentioned earlier, the original Revelations was originally designed for the 3DS, but ultimately ported to last generation consoles, including the Wii U. The HD version shares a lot of elements with the original game, but increases the resolution and quality of certain assets. Unfortunately, its portable nature still shines through, and it's clearly the less impressive looking game overall. With such basic roots then, we expected a lot from the Switch version. After all, the mobile GPU in the system is a lot more powerful than the original 3DS hardware, and in fact last generation consoles. But alas, it's not quite what we had hoped. But first, on the positive side, it does at least run at 1080p in docked mode and 720p in portable, just like Revelations 2, making for a reasonably crisp presentation. It doesn't appear to be over sharpened either. Either way, it's a clean looking Switch game, that's for sure, especially when played in portable mode. It still comes with many of the original game's caveats, however. All cutscenes are still low resolution pre-rendered video clips that look a lot worse than the real-time graphics, and on top of that, some of the presentation choices feel a little strange. The late title card, for instance, should have been an epic moment, but instead, there's a short loading screen between it and the previous sequence. The user interface is also rendered entirely at 720p, with text appearing blurrier compared to the sequel. While not a huge deal in and of itself, these types of things rob the game of some presentational polish. The general look of the game also feels rather dated. Character animation is simplistic, the FOV is very low, the environment's boxy, and texture's rather low resolution. There's simply nothing impressive about what's on display here, that's for certain. Now, I don't have access to the other console versions of Revelations, unfortunately, but reviewing videos suggest that the Switch version is at least a match for them, only with a higher output resolution when docked. So, with a dead simple presentation and roots in last generation consoles, this should be an easy 60 frames per second, right? Well, that's where the next disappointment stems from. You see, the frame rate is unlocked and unstable, much like its sequel, Of course, the average frame rate is at least higher overall, and many sections do come close to holding 60 frames per second, but it still often feels like the game is hanging just below the desired level. And when you step outside, things get a lot worse, with drops that go well under the expected 60 frames per second. Now, the frame rate is perfectly playable, mind you, but it doesn't look or feel great as a result of this inconsistency. Needless to say, we're not that impressed. It looks subpar for a Switch game, and the performance just isn't good enough for our tastes. It's a very mediocre iteration of the game. It feels like a lot more could have been done here. Okay, sure, it is technically an improvement over last generation console versions, but the added judder from the inconsistent frame rate is really distracting to me. This is a your mileage may vary type of situation. Performance does at least appear to be ever so slightly smoother in portable mode, which incidentally is where the game looks best. And really, that's the conclusion we came to in the end. If you're planning to play these games on a TV, you could do a lot better elsewhere. Revelations 2 is simply better on PS4, Xbox One, and the PC. While Revelations 1 has a very cheap PC port as well to smooth out these issues. If you're looking for a portable experience, however, it's a very reasonable package. Revelations 2 feels like a solid port for the hardware, and it looks great in mobile mode, while Revelations 1 is merely competent, but ultimately superior looking to the original 3DS release. Still, the overall results here aren't too bad considering the last major MT framework outing on the same hardware was Resident Evil 5, which was released on the Nvidia Shield TV, and looks simply atrocious in comparison. A horrible frame rate and hugely reduced visuals really hurt the experience. So, while Revelations 2 may never have been a demanding game, at least the Switch iteration isn't a complete mess like Resident Evil 5 is. And thus, that's really all we have for today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.